What does it feel like to be surrounded, 5-1, with almost no ammunition, no winter gear, and most of your medical company already destroyed in a night raid, and still be expected to hold a perimeter around an entire town? What do you do when 4 German soldiers walk up under a white flag and hand your commanding general a written demand for total annihilation if he does not surrender within 2 hours? U.S. Army veterans who fought at Bastogne still remember exactly how their acting division commander responded, because the answer became one of the most famous single words in the entire history of the United States Army. On December 22, 1944, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe read that German ultimatum, thought about it for a few minutes and wrote back one word: nuts. We'll show you exactly what that word actually meant and what it cost to back it up in a moment. First, you need to understand exactly how bad the situation at Bastogne had already become by the time that white flag appeared. This is the story of the Siege of Bastogne. U.S. Army veterans of the 101st Airborne still call it their division's defining fight. The threat on December 16, 1944, Adolf Hitler launched Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front, a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest that tore a deep bulge into the American line and sent roughly 400,000 German troops, supported by more than 1,000 armored vehicles, driving hard toward the vital port of Antwerp. The crossroads town of Bastogne, Belgium, sat directly in the path of that advance, and holding it became essential to slowing the entire German offensive down. The 101st Airborne Division moved into position at Bastogne on December 19, establishing a defensive perimeter with barely 2 days to prepare before German forces completed their encirclement. Most of the division's senior leadership was elsewhere at the time, leaving Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division's artillery commander, as acting commander responsible for the entire defense. A German night raid on the division's medical company wiped out nearly the entire unit's capacity to treat wounded soldiers, a devastating loss that meant men hit in the fighting that followed would face treatment with only a fraction of the medical support the division actually needed. By the morning of December 19th, American forces defending Bastogne were outnumbered roughly 5-1, cut off, and facing German units still riding the momentum of the offensive's early, dramatic success. The town's strategic value lay almost entirely in its road network, a hub where 7 major highways converged, making it an essential objective for any German force attempting to move armor and supplies at speed through the Ardennes toward Antwerp. German commanders understood exactly what capturing that road hub would mean for their broader timetable, and American planners understood equally clearly that denying them that hub, whatever the cost, would force German columns into slower, more difficult routes around the town rather than through it. That single fact, more than any other, explains why a comparatively small American garrison found itself defending a position against a German force so significantly larger, and why holding that position mattered so disproportionately to the outcome of the wider offensive. The speed at which the 101st Airborne was thrown into the defense of Bastogne reflected the genuine emergency Allied commanders faced in the offensive's opening days. The division had been resting and refitting near Reims, France, recovering from the costly fighting of Operation Market Garden weeks earlier, when orders arrived to move immediately toward the developing crisis in the Ardennes. Trucks carried the division's paratroopers through the night toward Bastogne with minimal advance planning time, many units arriving and moving directly into defensive positions, with barely enough daylight remaining to survey the ground they would need to hold. That compressed timeline meant the division's initial defensive preparations were, by necessity, considerably less thorough than commanders would have preferred under less urgent circumstances, a reality that shaped every subsequent day of the siege that followed. The secret development: there was no secret weapon holding Bastogne together in those first desperate days. What there was instead was a full 360-degree defensive perimeter, artillery crews who had learned to mass their fire with brutal precision, and a division commander who understood exactly how strong his position actually was, even when the paper math suggested otherwise. McAuliffe's decision to form his division into a complete circular perimeter around the town, rather than a conventional linear front, reflected the reality that Bastogne was surrounded on every side and needed to be defended that way. The division's artillery, concentrated and coordinated with unusual precision given the circumstances, repeatedly broke up German assaults before they could fully develop, plucking advancing tanks and infantry out of the fight long enough for American infantry to hold or retake contested ground. It was exhausting, grinding work sustained under conditions that included almost no winter gear for many of the defenders, dwindling food supplies, and ammunition stocks that had to be rationed with increasing care, as the siege continued day after day with no immediate relief in sight. On the morning of December 22nd, 4 German soldiers, 2 officers and 2 enlisted men, approached the American lines near Remoifas under 2 white flags, delivering a written surrender ultimatum addressed to the American commander, threatening total annihilation of the town's defenders and civilian population if the garrison did not capitulate within 2 hours. Private First Class Leo Palmer, a Browning automatic rifle gunner with F Company, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, was among the first Americans to actually encounter the approaching German delegation, describing officers in long overcoats and polished black boots walking directly past his own foxhole. The path that message took to reach McAuliffe himself reflects the layered, methodical communication structure that kept a besieged division functioning under pressure. Palmer's foxhole position reported the approaching delegation up through the chain of command, reaching the 2nd Battalion command post at Marvy, which in turn notified 327th Regimental Headquarters in Bastogne itself. With the regimental commander, Colonel Bud Harper, out inspecting his unit's positions at the moment the message arrived, the senior officer present, Major Alvin Jones, made the decision to notify division headquarters directly and request instructions, a chain of individual, unhurried decisions made correctly under pressure that ensured the ultimatum reached McAuliffe's own desk without confusion or delay, exactly the kind of disciplined staff work that a division under siege depended on functioning correctly at every single link. Technical supremacy. There is no chapter in this story about superior American firepower, because the men holding Bastogne that December were, by nearly every conventional measure, outnumbered, outgunned, and critically short on the basic supplies a besieged force needs to sustain itself. When the ultimatum reached division headquarters, McAuliffe's first reaction, according to the officers present, was simply "aw nuts," a dismissive, almost reflexive response to a demand he considered wildly out of proportion to the actual battlefield situation, in which his own troops had, in his assessment, been giving the Germans one hell of a beating, rather than facing any realistic prospect of annihilation. Tasked with composing a formal written reply, McAuliffe sat with his staff trying to find the right words, admitting after several minutes that he genuinely did not know how to phrase an appropriately dismissive response. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard offered the solution. "What you said initially would be hard to beat," he told McAuliffe, reminding him of his own first reaction. The suggestion drew applause from the assembled officers, and McAuliffe wrote it down. The formal reply, delivered to the waiting German officers, read in its entirety, to the German commander Nuts, the American commander. When the confused Germans asked for clarification on the message's meaning, the American officer delivering it explained plainly that in ordinary English it meant the same thing as "go to hell." That single word and the composed, almost casual confidence behind it reflected something real about the actual state of the American defense rather than simple bravado. McAuliffe knew the strength of his position, the quality of the men holding it, and the increasing likelihood of resupply and relief, and his reply communicated exactly that assessment in the bluntest possible terms. The reply's delivery back to German lines carried its own moment of pointed theatre. Colonel Harper, having returned to his headquarters in time to learn what McAuliffe had written, personally volunteered to carry the message back to the waiting German officers, walking out to deliver a folded piece of paper that the confused delegation initially could not interpret at all. When Lieutenant Henk asked directly whether the reply was affirmative or negative, Harper reportedly told the German officers, with a bluntness that matched McAuliffe's own, that the reply was decidedly not affirmative, and that if they continued their attack, the American forces defending Bastogne would kill every German soldier who came within range. That exchange, delivered face-to-face between an American colonel and a German delegation still holding a white flag, extended the same spirit of the written reply into a direct, personal confrontation, leaving absolutely no ambiguity about how the Americans intended to respond to the ultimatum they had just received. The global impact. The Germans, enraged by the response, redoubled their efforts to take Bastogne by force, at real cost to their own broader offensive timeline, since every additional hour and every additional unit committed to breaking the siege was an hour, and a unit not advancing toward Antwerp. American lines were broken through by German armor at several points over the following days, but artillery fire repeatedly plucked German tanks out of these breakthroughs long enough for American infantry to retake the lost ground, a pattern that held the perimeter together through some of the most dangerous hours of the entire siege. On December 23rd, the skies finally cleared enough for Allied aircraft to reach the besieged town, and cargo planes began dropping desperately needed supplies and ammunition to the defenders below, while American P-47 Thunderbolts provided close air support that helped relieve pressure on artillery crews, who had nearly exhausted their own ammunition stocks by that point in the fighting. Relief finally arrived on December 26th, when the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, having covered more than 100 miles in just 5 days, as part of General George Patton's rapid pivot of the 3rd Army North to relieve the siege, broke through German lines and reached Bastogne, ending the encirclement. By the time the broader Battle of the Bulge was finally resolved in the Allies' favor by mid-January 1945, the United States Army had suffered more than 75,000 casualties across the entire campaign, a toll that reflects just how costly Hitler's last major offensive on the Western Front actually was to bring to a final, decisive end. Patton's own contribution to the relief effort deserves recognition as its own remarkable feat of operational planning, executed under extraordinary time pressure, redirecting an entire armored corps 90 degrees from its existing axis of advance and moving it more than 100 miles north through winter conditions in a matter of days, represented exactly the kind of logistical achievement that few armies of the era could have managed at all, let alone in the compressed timeframe Patton's staff actually delivered. That the relief column reached Bastogne as quickly as it did reflects not simply the urgency of the mission, but months of underlying staff work and unit discipline that made an operational pivot of this scale and speed possible in the first place. A less celebrated but equally essential companion to the defiant stand McAuliffe's own troops had been maintaining inside the perimeter throughout the preceding week. A conclusion. U.S. Army veterans of the 101st Airborne Division have carried the story of Bastogne forward for 8 decades now as one of the defining chapters in their entire division's history. A siege that came to symbolize exactly the kind of composed, disciplined defiance the Nuts reply captured in a single word. On Christmas Eve of 1944, still surrounded and still fighting, McAuliffe issued a message to his own troops recounting the German ultimatum and his reply, informing them that an American counterattack and relief were already underway, a document preserved today at the National Archives alongside the original surrender demand itself, physical artifacts of a siege that veterans and their families still travel to see in person. What actually held Bastogne together through those days was never a single dramatic gesture. It was the accumulated effect of artillery crews rationing shells with brutal discipline, infantry retaking ground German tanks had just broken through, and thousands of individual soldiers enduring cold, hunger, and sustained combat without most of the basic supplies their situation demanded. All of it happening in the hours and days before and after that one famous word was ever written down. U.S. Army veterans who fought there understand this distinction clearly. That Nuts was not the thing that saved Bastogne. It was simply the moment when the composed confidence already holding the perimeter together found its way into a single sentence blunt enough for the entire world to remember. The physical conditions inside the perimeter during those days deserve their own recognition alongside the more famous exchange of messages, because they shaped every hour of the siege regardless of what was happening at any single headquarters. Many soldiers defending Bastogne had been rushed into position so quickly that they lacked adequate winter clothing entirely, fighting through some of the coldest weather the region had seen in years in field jackets and standard uniforms never designed for sustained exposure at these temperatures. Frostbite casualties mounted alongside combat wounds, straining a medical system already crippled by the loss of most of the division's medical company in the opening days of the siege. Food rationing became a daily reality for men who had arrived with only what they could carry, and by the time aerial resupply finally became possible on December 23rd, many units had been surviving on dramatically reduced rations for several consecutive days. These were the conditions under which McAuliffe's famous reply was written, delivered, and then backed up by days of continued fighting, a context that makes the composed confidence of that single word all the more remarkable given everything the men holding the line around it were simultaneously enduring. The aerial resupply effort itself, once weather finally permitted it on December 23rd, represented its own logistical achievement conducted under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Transport pilots flew low over a battlefield still contested by German anti-aircraft positions, dropping supply canisters into a perimeter that had, by that point, shrunk considerably from its original size, requiring precise navigation to ensure the desperately needed ammunition, medical supplies, and food actually reached the men who needed them rather than drifting into German-held territory nearby. Ground crews and quartermaster personnel worked to distribute those supplies as quickly as they came down, a coordinated effort between air and ground elements that, however less celebrated than the nuts reply itself, proved every bit as essential to the garrison's ability to continue holding its position through the final days before Patton's relief column finally arrived. For the men who lived through it, the Siege of Bastogne was never experienced as a single dramatic narrative arc building toward one famous exchange of messages. It was experienced, hour by hour, as an accumulation of small, exhausting decisions, whether to fire the next artillery round or conserve it, whether a frostbitten foot could still support a soldier standing watch through another freezing night, whether the next German assault would finally be the one that broke through a specific stretch of the perimeter. That granular, exhausting reality is precisely what U.S. Army veterans of the 101st Airborne have spent decades trying to convey to audiences who know the siege primarily through McAuliffe's famous one-word reply, a story that captures the spirit of the defense perfectly, but that, on its own, cannot fully convey the sustained physical and psychological toll the actual defense of the town demanded from every soldier who held that perimeter.